Hello, BookTube. Well, as you can see, I have another guest. I'm Little Miss Popularity on this channel. This is my friend Zach from the Brattle Bookshop.
Hi, everybody.
And we have a subject today. We always have a subject. Zach and I always have a subject. It's not always professional baseball. It's often book related. We've got a winner today. We've got a subject today that a lot of you are directly involved in. A lot of you actually participate in this subject. Book people, I think, just generally do.
Well, I also, and it will, I'm sure, get into this at some point, but just people. People are into this, or people participate in this whether they know it or like it or not.
And before any of you start thinking what I can hear you thinking about what the subject must be, kindly get your mind out of the gutter. We are talking about ephemera.
Ephemera. Yes, you might not, ephemera might not interest you, but you interest it.
You do it. Almost certainly you do. Unless you have an entirely electronic book collection.
Which is true, but even that would probably leave a trail of some sort of matter behind.
So that's true. You're the one who's been to fancy, expensive book seminars and classes and whatnot. How would you describe ephemera? How would you define it?
It's a tough thing to define, and it gets really squishy around the edges when collectors are involved. But what it means is something that's produced usually on paper, but not always, for some sort of circumscribed purpose. Whether it be occasional, something's produced for for an occasion, something's produced for a necessarily small audience, something's produced for on a very small budget that makes it small or makes it flimsy. So we're talking about pamphlets, we're talking about posters, we're talking about flyers, anything like that. So ephemera in the business is often given the shorthand paper. Ephemera dealers often refer to themselves as paper dealers, because that's usually the form that it takes. Newspapers, letters, certainly. It doesn't have to be printed material, but anything that's produced, without the idea towards physical preservation as sort of its first purpose, or one of its major purposes.
Not to jump straight to money,
yeah,
but does the evanescent, I mean, you're talking about things that aren't, like you say, they aren't designed to last. Does that quality of these things increase their collectability, the value?
Yeah, that's exactly right, because and this comes out in the nature of the word too. Things that are ephemeral are supposed to disappear, and that's what makes those things that survive valuable to collectors. So it's almost counterintuitive, but the more poorly made a physical object, oftentimes the more valuable it is to a collector if it does somehow survive in good order.
And the Brattle as a shop, we should mention, right, for newcomers, that you are a long-time denizen of the Brattle Bookshop in Boston.
Yes, in Boston. I'm beaming in live from our basement now, surrounded by reference materials and to be sorted and researched and cataloged old books. But we're right in downtown Boston. We have 3 floors of general used and rare and antiquarian books. And although it's too hot for him today to be there, we have an outside sale lot with book stalls and book carts for sale book browsers like Steve. But it's also going to be, I mean, it's probably already 85 and very humid out there today.
Yeah.
So that'll
I think the hot weather is going to break today. I think
it will. And next week is supposed to be prime Brattle lot browsing weather.
Although for those of you who are listening and maybe contemplating, I respect boundaries in the Brattle sale lot. I do not strike up conversations. I want to, but I don't.
even yeah, with most people. So some staff, I think,
Yeah, yes, the staff are fair game.
staff,
But for customers, I try not to intrude on the sanctified Brattle experience. but but so the Brattle deals in ephemera.
we do, and more now than we did even 5 or 6 years ago. We have numerous ephemera sections, um, sort of ranging from $1 for old National Geographic maps, which can be really cool. We have a lot of $5 pamphlets and postcards. Postcards are another great entire universe of ephemera collecting. And then we also have very rare and very valuable pieces of ephemera. And I actually have a few stacks over here, depending on which direction our conversation goes.
Well,
brought some.
I want to see them. I want to see all of the props that you have assembled.
Great.
But the connection here would be, I'm assuming the connection here would be that people put ephemera in books.
A lot of times
That's
people
why
put it in, well, a lot of times people put ephemera in books. I collect bookmarks. I have hundreds and probably thousands of bookmarks from bookshops all over the world, from libraries, from homemade things that people use to mark their place in books. So that's certainly one area of collecting. Sometimes the ephemera is the book. Something like poetry chapbooks or off prints from scholarly publications, things like that. Poetry is an area that I really like, and it's an area that really lends itself to a small format. So a lot of very collectible poetry is first comes out in a chapbook format or in a pamphlet format.
Most of the modern poetry that I've seen, when I see it come out in a small format, I always want to urge it to be even smaller. How about be non-existent? That would be great. But tastes, I'm told, differ.
Yes.
What else?
They do differ very often. They differ from yours, as a matter of fact.
So has it ever happened? Of course, I ask this every time, but the serendipitous nature of the Brattle buying table, or the Brattle when you go out on buys with the van, which you've done innumerable times, that the serendipitous aspect always fascinates me.
Yes.
And so I naturally want to know, have you found valuable ephemera in non-valuable books where you weren't looking for it?
Occasionally I've found, and this has happened a couple times with nondescript, say 19th century books. You flip through and there's a letter from Walt Whitman in it, a short note from Walt Whitman. That is something that happened. Can't remember what the book, it was time appropriate, but it wasn't a Whitman book. It wasn't literature at all. But there was a letter, a short note from Walt Whitman stuck in. That tends to happen because things that get, books can be kind of like fossils in a way. You mark your place in a book with whatever you have handy, and that could be the last time you ever touch that book for whatever reason. It could go back on the shelf, and 200 years later, when someone picks that book up again, all of a sudden, whatever you were just using to mark your place could have an entirely different meaning. And that is certainly an interesting and really exciting aspect of ephemera. Most things are much more mundane than that, but still can be very interesting.
The shop doesn't catch it all, right? I mean, you have
no.
the outdoor sale lot. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Brattle, but there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books out there.
No, we couldn't possibly. We've had people come in into the shop and say, I found $50 in this book. That happened. It doesn't happen a lot, but it certainly has happened. Or they find a letter or an autograph or a flyer for a concert that turns out to have collectability inside a dollar book that they were sort of wavering on anyway. So
I found ephemera in the sale lot.
Right.
The most depressing example ever that comes to mind is that I found a book and went, ooh, I want this really bad. I carried it around with me as I looked throughout the wholesale lot. And then when I was done, I looked through the books that I have, when I've got an armload of them, and I looked through that one, and there was indeed a postcard in it of mine, because the book had been mine, and I had thought it. Who knows how many times I found it at the Brattle and said, "Ooh, I've got to have this."
Well, I like that you now tend to mark the books in the back, mark somewhere in the books when you buy them and sell them back to the Brattle, and you can sort of keep a tally.
Tally. Well, many times something attracts my eye.
Yeah.
Oh.
So certainly the inadvertent, or at least not native or related to the book, pieces of ephemera that wind up in books can be very exciting. But and that's a whole, we're talking about all of these wide areas of collecting that can all fit under the umbrella of ephemera.
And do you have examples of non-native intrusions into books?
Do I have? Oh, well, I don't have too many that I can show as an object lesson at the moment, because those we don't tend to pay much attention to if they're not related to the book. One thing that I will say that turns up a lot in 19th century books, there was flower pressing, and 18th century a little too. Flower pressing was a hobby that people would press flowers between the pages of books. And
I've seen that innumerable times.
Yes. So occasionally I'll be collating a book from that time period, and I'll be, having to sort of blow out or brush out these, decaying botanical matter, which interestingly, this isn't really something that someone who presses flowers into books pays attention to, but somebody 100 or 200 years later certainly does. The term is offsetting, that something like something that's organic will actually change the coloring on the paper of the book.
Yeah.
Usually darken it or yellow it. And so you can, even if you don't see whatever was in the book, it leaves a little shadow in the book. Sometimes a big shadow. This is another thing that comes up a lot with the practice of pressing news clippings into a book, say a contemporary review of a book. Again, a very interesting thing to do, but 50 or 100 years later, you're going to see the shadow, the outline of that news clipping as it had sort of decayed at a different rate from the paper of the book. So beware. We usually, if any ephemera is related to the book at all, other than, just happenstance was used as a marker, we try to keep it in the book. But with something like that, where it could degrade the paper of the book, we'll put it in something, a little archival sleeve or something non-acidic, so that it can stay with the book but not do any damage to the book.
But you make exceptions in the case of something like the Whitman letter, or the case of something that has historical value on its own.
On its own
book.
Sometimes if there's any way to connect it other than just the random connection that it was in the book. For instance, if there was some way to connect the owner of the book to Whitman, or we try to keep things together if it makes sense, even at all, because I think that's more interesting for the collector to have. One of the really fun things about collecting is you get to sort of explore the context of that item that you now have outside of its original historical context.
Yeah, you've told me in the past that that's the heart and soul of learning the job.
It really is, to see how these books were produced and used. Actually, that's a nice little segue to an aspect of ephemera that I know you will like, because you participate in this every day. Your viewers might know, I'm sure a lot of them probably do, that you sell books back to us on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, if I didn't, I'd be up to my eyeballs.
You would. And very often you will, there will be sort of publicity materials that came with those books that you got as review copies. This is a practice that's been going on for, I was going to say 100 years, much longer than 100 years.
Yeah, I get publicity sheets and pages in books from decades and decades and decades ago.
Yep. Especially for collectors of literature, that is a really sought after element to any book, is to get something that was originally sent with the book and meant to be with it. I have right here a first edition copy of Amy Lowell's What's a Clock, which I'm pretty sure won the Pulitzer Prize. Maybe it did. One of these. This might have been her prize winner. She won one or two. But anyway, it has tucked in to the literary editor. This is from Houghton Mifflin Company.
Oh my.
Soliciting a review.
Look at that.
And when was this published? This was 1925. And then it even has a little notice that it was an advanced copy. Nowadays, and even during this time, publishers would send galleys rather than finished copies of the book. This is a finished copy, which was sent out for review back in 1925. But even in the 20s, they had galleys, so sort of more cheaply made paperback versions of the text to get advanced reviews before the book's actually available for sale. But anything that's associated with the sort of production of the book or the reception of the book once it's published really can help distinguish a copy that a collector is looking for.
1925.
1925.
Which
I'm told is now almost 100 years ago. Which still doesn't seem possible.
So, all right, but okay, so you are describing a gradation here of value.
Yes, absolutely.
So it sounds like you're saying that the pinnacle of value is something one of a kind that's directly connected with the book itself.
Yes, absolutely. And I wouldn't say this is one of a kind. There are probably a few review copies of this particular title kicking around, but when you're
sent out dozens of them.
Yes. Oh yeah. When you're talking about, but survival of them is a whole other thing. Whether or not the book survives, but whether or not it survives with those inserted elements is a whole other thing that helps make a copy like this more valuable for sale and certainly more interesting for a collector than just a first edition copy of the book.
So in a case like that, the Amy Lowell book, you would leave the card in the book.
Oh, absolutely.
Whereas if the Brattle sold you a box of old books, yeah, they'd been in the basement of the house forever, and there was a 16th century hymnal, and you opened it up and there was a letter from William Shakespeare, you would not keep that in the book. You would not even keep that in the shop. That would go on.
Right. Unless there was some connection that could be made to the manuscript letter, to the book, because then it would just, again, in terms of collectible interest and from my perspective in terms of price, it would just kick it up another notch.
It'd be really neat if that letter said, I wrote the plays that bear my name, even though I had no education and no experience. That would be really great if that letter said that.
It would be nice if it spelled it out.
Nice if it spelled it out. Yeah. I actually wrote all these plays, even though I was a country bumpkin with no education. But that's a subject for a different Zach dialogue.
Yeah, probably not one you want to have with me, but we could try it.
So what if we're looking at scales, what is next?
Well, as a matter of fact, I have another Amy Lowell title to
bring all this attention to my girl.
Well, a local gal. She made good. So here's another first edition. This is Sword Blades and Poppy Seeds, and Poppy Seed. This is also Houghton Mifflin was her publisher. Houghton Mifflin and I'm sorry, this was Macmillan in 1914. This was a little before the previous one, but we have a nice piece of printed ephemera a little differently that was laid in with this one. And this is, oops, with the compliments of the author.
Oh, wow.
And that is sort of a start to this one. Now, this book isn't inscribed or signed by Amy Lowell, but what it did have inside it was a letter from Amy Lowell to the recipient, and her, I don't know if you can, how well this turns up, but her handwriting is really is kind of obnoxiously difficult to read. It took me a long time to go through this and figure out what was actually doing. But so this is a letter from her inviting the recipient, who is a gentleman named Louis Ledoux, who was a very, very minor poet, but very, very major art collector around that time, and sort of literary person in the literary circle, not necessarily like a literary kingmaker, but he was a good person to know if you were a writer, if you were an artist. He was very involved, and it seems like could certainly fund some sort of project. And this is, again, Amy Lowell inviting this Mr. Ledoux to dinner when she was in New York. And it also has a little Miss Amy Lowell calling card.
Oh, wow.
Which, where she crossed out Brookline and said the Hotel Regis on 8th Avenue, which is where she was staying in New York. So this is, again, sort of a next level up. You have some printed ephemera. This time a personal compliments slip from the author, but you also have an autograph letter from the author that, again, ties this book to what was going on in the author's life at the time.
And proves that the author personally held that copy.
Absolutely.
Personally handled it. There must be collectors that really value that.
Really like that. Usually the easiest way to know that is that the book was inscribed or signed, but something like this, because it's even a more substantial glimpse into that author, a letter that accompanied a book as a gift.
And her handwriting is stubby and pugnacious, just like she was.
That's very
coincidence.
I would wonder. That. But she has. I do like her signature. She did has a little flourish at the bottom. That's nice.
Wow. Okay, so when we're talking about grades like this, is there? I always ask you this, no matter what our subject is, but is there a holy grail? Is there a type of ephemera that is just unheard of, that something that would make your whole year if it came to the shop?
I'm sure there probably could be a lot of things. I mean, something in Shakespeare's hand would certainly be fantastic, especially if it were something in Shakespeare's hand with a printed version of one of his works. That would be a pretty fantastic ephemeral element. I always think of the marriage of the print and the manuscript when it comes to ephemera.
Sorry to interrupt.
Hold on one second, Steve. Sorry. Hey, what's up?
The indispensable man, ladies and gentlemen. He's actually at work.
No, I'll talk to him. Sorry, it's the boss. I do have to take this. It'll just be a second. Second.
The boss has been on this channel. The owner of the Brattle is Ken Glass. He subbed for Zach in one of these chats about books. So some of you have seen him. You also know him from Antiques Roadshow. If you ever watch Antique Roadshow on the big TV, he's a frequent guest on Antique Roadshow, because people find old books. It's a natural thing for them to bring to the show. I found a box of old books in the attic. Are these worth anything?
And it was put in
one of the best book appraisers in the world.
And it's just a very unassuming thing that has very different.
Why he can't get a spare minute from phone calls, because he's necessary.
So it's
Man and neck, this
yeah, it's
conversation.
just I almost didn't even look at it.
We're lucky
But I
because
did, and
of
so
the
you'll see what I mean if you see it. Hopefully it might be gone before then.
Just look at all those books on those shelves.
Okay.
The basement is crammed with them, just crammed with them. And the rest of the shop is.
Yeah, I don't think I ever saw it in the house.
Brattle, you really ought to go. It's really worth going at least once to see it.
I really don't know. It wasn't with it. Yeah.
This is actually why we're having this discussion a little earlier in the day. I don't know when I'll end up posting it, but we used to film these Zach hats later in the day, and they just became impossible because if there are 100 people in the shop, there are going to be 100 questions, and later in the day became unworkable. But even now, he's giving us some Kurt Vonnegut ephemera specifically to get my goat.
No, I think it's we're right where we should be. I'm not worried about that.
There's the master himself.
Well, and also with the Franklins and all that.
If only all of the novels that he wrote were ephemera. Wouldn't that be great? If they'd only had a shelf life of 5 or 6 minutes, wouldn't that be great? If that were the case, if Kurt Vonnegut's novels disappeared in 5 or 6 minutes, I really would bless you, Mr. Rosewater. But unfortunately, they stick around. They have fans. I bet our guest today is
Monday.
When he's on the phone, he can't object. He can't. Well, naturally, now he's holding up a piece of ephemera dealing with the Red Army. Because when Zach is not tripping over horrible contemporary writers,
I don't think so.
He actually loves the great.
Thatcher. Thatcher's coming in.
So go figure. So this weird contrast. But this is the reason. This is the reason why we had to change the time of our chats, because
have a good time.
Completely unworkable.
Sorry about that.
Was that Connor?
Is what common?
Was that Connor?
But that was not Connor. That was Ken.
Oh,
that was Ken Gloss, owner and proprietor of the Brattle Bookshop.
But it was Connor who phoned you down, wasn't it? Was him?
It was not. It was not Connor. It's not Connor.
Well, we can't badmouth Ken.
Nor would we want to. No, we want to.
But you showed us. You showed us Kurt Vonnegut.
Oh, so I love this. So this is very often one of the things I like about a lot of ephemera is it was used to sell something. A lot of ephemera is sort of commercial in nature, one way or another, and it
endlessly pumping strangers for money. Kurt Vonnegut, you astonish me.
It's a thing. This was a campaign that Absolute Vodka did in the 90s. They did a few of these postcards. There was a whole ad campaign. I'm sure it was in the New Yorker and other places. He did some drawings, but he also signed a few of them, and this is one of them from my collection. And now this is an example of ephemera, of a piece of ephemera that was sort of made to be collectible. So a postcard, it's an interesting sort of dichotomy, because a postcard is very ephemeral, sent to, express a couple things that once they're digested can pretty much be, the paper can go away, like most letters.
But this love sending postcards to people saying, having a wonderful time, very glad you're not here.
Yeah.
No one seemed to appreciate that.
Exactly right. I also this is also from my collection. I have a review copy of his novel Galapagos from the mid-'80s, and this is a publicity photo that was sent with the review copy, which is
fairly common as a practice, was it not?
Very common. Yeah.
A photo, I guess, presumably because of the assumption that maybe the book section editor would need it and might not have one on file.
Exactly, that they could use in the print in the version, if they so wanted to
accompany a review, and might not have it on their own, might not have one on file.
Yep. Yeah, and probably wouldn't without it. Even when I was sending these out in the early 2000s, chances are you couldn't get a decent digital image to use in your when you were putting together your print publication. So you'd need that if you wanted
the early
to.
2000s.
Yeah, the early 2000s. Probably not too long long after that it started to change.
No, for a while there, the only high resolution images you could get were porn, or so I've been told.
Yeah.
And everything else came after that.
That's right. That's right.
But I've seen black and white author photos like that in many, many books out in the lot. Just they're common.
That's yeah. They would send them out with, if they send out 500 review copies, they would send out 500 glossy photos tucked in with the press release.
I found one in the shop once in one of the earliest collections by Christopher Hitchens.
No, really? Oh, that's actually something.
Black and white headshot, and I looked at it and thought, "You wish you looked like this. You didn't look like this when this book came out, much less now."
that's something that that had we known about it, or had I known about it, I would have picked it off, because that's something that we could have that would have gotten a higher price for the book.
I heard a rumor, a literary rumor. I don't know if it's true. I heard a rumor that Sinclair Lewis used to put black and white author photos of Upton Sinclair in his books. I don't know if that's true. I've never seen it myself, but I know that one of them, I don't remember which one it was, but one of them used to be absolutely maddened by their interchangeability.
Yeah. Another, since we're on these are examples not necessarily of a commercial enterprise, but certainly dissemination of information. Ephemera, certainly in advertising, but also things like handbills and flyers, which, if something has doesn't have a very big budget and they want to get the word out, or things that are produced by marginalized communities for whatever reason, that don't have resources, of mass media to gather attention, or for some reason like that, would often use sort of cheap duplication techniques to spread the word for events, for causes. And I have a couple examples of that from San Francisco in the 1960s. This is a handbill from January 1967 or thereabouts. This is an advertisement for what was called the Human Bee Inn, which was in January of 1967. And this, you can even see the little pin marks right on the where a push pin had put it on a cork board or something, or something out in San Francisco. But this was at Golden Gate Park, and it was one of the first big gatherings of counterculture personalities. There were Ginsberg was there, Gary Snyder was there, Jefferson Airplane, bands like that, Timothy Leary. But there were about 20,000 people who came at Golden Gate Park, and a lot of the reason they knew to come was for tons of things like this around the city, in various places, where they couldn't do, say, a radio ad in 1967.
Right.
Because this was, very much sort of the birth of mass participation in the counterculture. If that's,
I wonder how many of those pamphlets would have been made.
Oh, they're probably thousands and thousands, but most of them probably ended up trampled underfoot not too long after that.
So is there an element then of detection with ephemera? It sounds like
absolutely
something in a book, you would have to know.
Well, this one is something you can tie to an event that actually happened, and the materials, if you know a little about the duplication techniques at that time that were available cheaply in the paper, you can pretty much say, yes, this is authentic. That makes sense for the time period. This is what it is. Some of them are a lot harder. And here's another one from about the same time. This is Free Huey or Free Street, Free Huey is the tagline. This being Huey Newton, and this is probably done in San Francisco and put out in San Francisco again, probably sometime in 1968. And this was to galvanize support for Huey Newton and the Black Panther movement.
But
and this, of course,
there can't be more than a dozen of those extant.
Not too many of this. Now there are a fair amount of things like this, but because they could be produced pretty quickly and cheaply, there are lots of versions of things like this in lots of different sizes with lots of different graphics or text. So it's very interesting. But yes, these things, again, you can see this one was actually used. It has the little push pin marks in the side. So when you have something like this, it takes a little more digging around to figure out roughly when it was produced, roughly where it was produced. And sometimes you're left to just sort of, getting close.
Now we're running out of time,
Yes.
but I want to ask you, you're the least prescriptive of souls. So I'm wondering, in this circumstance, is this a time, I don't get the impression that it is, but is this a time where you would tell people don't stick your stuff in books? Or would you tell them just the opposite? Fill your books with ephemera.
Yeah, I tend to,
You've already mentioned that it will discolor the book. Some of them will discolor the book. But that's
some of them will, but that's, it will, but I kind of like that. I like variety. And, one of the reasons these things, well, the main reason these things become collectible and interesting is because there aren't many of them.
Right.
Because most people use them up and don't keep them. So I would say continue to do that so that the ones that do survive for whatever reason will be interesting. Now, phone books from 30 years ago are not terribly interesting. Phone books from 100 years ago, much more interesting. So, it's hard to look into the future for predictions, but no, I would never advise somebody to change their behavior.
The very young viewers are Googling what a phone book is right now.
That's right. No,